The first time Emily heard silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying. The machines had stopped beeping. The ICU lights dimmed. And for a brief second, time stopped. She stood next to the hospital bed, fingers trembling over the edge of a plastic rail, watching her son Noah, just 7 years old, sleeping, or sedated, she couldn't tell anymore. He was so small under those sterile white sheets, dwarfed by tubes and a tangle of machines. His face, pale, his lips slightly parted. He'd had his 4th seizure that month. And just like that, the world had fallen out from under her. Emily had made a deal with herself in those early days. If I can just make it to Monday, just get to Monday. But Mondays came and went, and so did any promise of a cure. Neurospecialists, EEG scans, meds she couldn't pronounce. All roads led to more questions, more side effects, and more of Noah disappearing behind the thick glass of pharmaceutical fog. It wasn't always this way. Before the seizures, before the exhaustion, before the endless rotating door of white coats and clipboards, Noah had been pure sunlight. The kind of kid who laughed too loud in the grocery store because he thought cartwheels were the funniest thing ever invented. The kind who asked questions like, "Do butterflies have best friends?" The kind who once made her cry laughing during a thunderstorm, just by dancing in the hallway, socks on, arms in the air. That boy was still in there, somewhere. But he was fading. And with him, so was Emily. She had become a breathless mother, running on fumes of hope and leftover coffee. Her marriage frayed, her job on life support. She spent nights Googling Latin words with 3 syllables and crying in the laundry room. No one prepared her for the relentlessness of watching her child fight something invisible, something incurable, and losing parts of himself along the way. When a friend mentioned narrative therapy at a support group meeting, Emily had half listened. "It's not talked about much," the woman had said, twirling a plastic water bottle cap in her fingers. "But it helped me reconnect with my son again, even if just for a little while." Emily gave a polite smile. She was done with new. There were too many things already, too many opinions, too much pain disguised as hope. But a week later, while sitting beside Noah in his sensory therapy appointment and watching him stack blocks with no interest, no spark, she remembered the woman's words. Reconnect. She whispered the word like a prayer. So one night she searched it. Narrative therapy. Stories? Journaling? It sounded childish, vague, but she kept reading. It wasn't about correcting thoughts. It was about rewriting a life. Not the facts, but the meaning behind them. It was about handing a pen back to someone whose story had been told too many times by everyone else. And in some cases, it was about writing alongside them. Story reauthorship, they called it. Externalization. The naming of the problem. That part struck her. Because for so long, epilepsy had been the author of Noah's life. And hers. Those next few weeks, Emily tried something different. She created The Land of Wobble, a storybook world inspired by Noah's seizures. Not to explain them in medical language, but to make them part of an epic. In this land, there was a boy called Noel, brave and fast, who sometimes got caught in shadow storms, dark, swirly energy that made time stutter and the sky flicker. But Noel had a sidekick, Ember, a glowing fox who helped him find his way back each time. They traveled across confusing lands, the fields of fog, the tower of weight, the courtroom of whitecoats, learning how to read maps made of feelings and fight battles no one else saw. At the end of each story, Noel always lit a fire, so they'd know he made it home again. At first, Noel just listened, blank-eyed, passive. But then one night he asked, "Why does Ember always know the way?" Emily paused and said, "Because she remembers the way you've walked even when you forget." He blinked, then oh so slightly smiled. And something shifted. She started writing therapy into their days. Quietly. She'd narrate small moments. "Look at that, Noel's eating toast like a champion. Ember's licking jam off his face." And slowly, very slowly, Noel started responding again. Pointing, smiling. Once he even drew Ember, lopsided ears and all. It wasn't magic. The seizures didn't stop. The meds didn't vanish. Doctors still talked over her in rooms filled with quiet doom. But something else returned. That spark. One night during another endless hospital stay, Noel whispered, "Do you think Ember's scared?" I choked on that, and then said, "Maybe, but she's holding on." That night, while sitting in the dark beside the hospital bed, Emily realized something. This was the therapy, the one no one had told her about. Doctors had monitored vitals, adjusted doses, scanned images of her son's brain, but none had asked to see his heart, or hers. No one had told her healing could begin when you stop trying to fix, but just start listening differently, through metaphor, through magic, through story. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real medicine lingered.
Noah's eyes lit up when he saw the new illustration. It was drawn on a paper napkin from the hospital cafeteria. Crude, hurried, imperfect. But to him, it might as well have been gold. "Is that the Bridge of Brave Steps?" he asked, his fingers gently brushing across the uneven doodles. Emily nodded. "Right before Noel crosses into the cloud caves. There's where the wind tells him things only he can hear." He sat quietly for a moment, eyes searching the lines. "That's where he met the sound that makes you remember, right?" Emily nearly cried. He remembered. Something about this wasn't just playful. Something about it was waking pieces of him back up. By now, this thing they had created, this story within the story, was growing wings of its own. The nurses started asking what Noel and Ember were up to that week. One even laminated one of Noah's drawings and stuck it on the door. "Cloud Watchers welcome." In a hospital painted in grays and whispers, this small orbit of imagination had become a rebellion, not against the illness, but against the way it tried to erase who Noah was. Emily started seeking guidance. She found a trauma-informed narrative therapy specialist with experience in pediatric care. Sessions didn't look like therapy. No long couches, no forced eye contact, nope, just colored pencils, open-ended questions, and space. The therapist, Lydia, explained the idea of externalizing the problem, naming it, seeing it, separating it from the child. Epilepsy isn't who he is. It's something Noel meets, over and over. That meeting doesn't define him. How he responds to it, that's where we find meaning. Ember was becoming more than just a sidekick. She was his anchor, his guide. She mirrored Emily, maybe, or maybe she was the part of Noel, calm, glowing, that he'd nearly forgotten he had. And in writing Noel's adventures, Emily was discovering something else too, herself. She hadn't realized how broken she'd become over the past year, how much she had stopped seeing herself as a person and only as a caretaker, with every decision shadowed by anxiety, guilt, and helplessness. But when she opened Noel's world, the metaphors seeped into her own hard truths. The Tower of Weights wasn't just for Noel, it was her, sitting in stale waiting rooms, holding her breath. The courtroom of white coats was where she tightened her spine and clutched medical records like armor. Even the land of Wobble wasn't just about seizures. It was about her world spinning, unfixed, unbalanced, ever shaking. And in each drawing, each tale, she was extracting her story from the wreckage. One afternoon, Back home now, Emily found Noah in the backyard, standing still, staring at the maple tree that had begun to shed its red leaves. "It's happening," he whispered. "What is?" "The wobble." His voice was serious, but not scared. "But Ember says it's just one wave, not a whole storm." Emily crouched down beside him, brushing his hair. "What should we do?" "Breathe. And remember, Ember told me about the light string path. We hold the string, we walk slow." He reached out, imaginary thread between his fingers, and they began to walk. That night, Emily wrote in her journal for the first time in months, not about seizure logs, not about behavior charts, just one sentence: reconnection is revolution. There's a myth about survival that says if you just push hard enough, shield hard enough, plan smart enough, you'll stop the pain from getting in. But what no one tells you is that some pain gets in anyway. No amount of control can protect you from being human, or from being a mother. But what she was learning, word by imperfect word, was that healing wasn't about escape. It was about witnessing, sitting with the ache, giving it a name, letting a child say, "This hurts," not in symptoms and lab work, but in dragons and foxfire. That was the therapy, the one they never put in discharge papers. Over the following months, The Land of Wobble became a full book, not published, not even printed professionally, just handwritten on thick paper with a ribbon binding. 37 pages of rough drawings and aching truths disguised as fantasy. Stories where Noel learned how to listen to the language inside lightning, where Ember taught him how to dance under the shaking sky. Emily sent a copy to Lydia, the therapist. A week later, she got back a letter. It read, "This may not be evidence-based, but it's heart-based, and that often comes first." They were right. This wasn't a therapy with brochures or clinical trials, but it was changing them. Deeply, quietly, holistically. Even their family sessions were transforming. Noah's father, who'd once drifted in and out of hospital visits like a ghost, now sat cross-legged on the rug, acting out voices in the story during bedtime. There was something in play that softened the edges between them, rebuilt the bridge one imaginary fox dart at a time. Even school started noticing. Noah hadn't just gotten more verbal. He was emotionally identifying triggers, describing them, requesting tools. "Can I draw Ember?" he would ask when overstimulated during class. It calmed him, grounded him. One day his teacher sent Emily a note that simply said, "He's starting to choose how to respond, not just react." That's a big shift. Of course, life wasn't easy. The seizures still surprised them. Some nights were long, some mornings unreachable. But now there existed a language, a world, a story, where the storm wasn't senseless. It was a call. And inside that call was power and resilience. Emily had once begged for a miracle, something to stop the storm. But now she understood the miracle wasn't suppression, it was illumination. That in this silent war, storytelling had not only given her child his voice back, it had given hers. She sat with other mothers at a community session one fall morning. The topic was coping, grief. They shared medications, side effects, breakdowns in parking lots. Then it was Emily's turn. She held up the homemade book, velvet ribbon fraying at the corners, a fingerprint smudge on page 12. "This," she said, looking down, "is the therapy they don't talk about." She looked up. Tears collected in her lashes, but she didn't blink them away. "It won't stop the pain, but it remakes it into something livable, into something beautiful. And silence fell, not empty this time, but full, like the breath you take after a storm. The email arrived on a Wednesday, just a subject line and a name Emily almost didn't recognize. Subject: heard about Noel and Ember, would love to chat. From Dr. Rena Albright, Pediatric Neurology Department. At first, she thought it was spam, but then she clicked. Dr. Albright was a research neurologist from Boston Children's, and apparently she'd found the storybook through a chain of curious emails from Lydia to a therapy forum to a community of educators and now psychologists were quietly passing the Land of Wobble around, intrigued by its simplicity and its impact. Your work resonates. Would you ever consider presenting it to our integrative care team? The message read. Emily dropped her phone. This was something she'd made between heartbreak and laundry piles, drawn in grocery aisles and hospital bedsides. And now they wanted her to present it? At a hospital? She whispered aloud, "But I'm just a mom." And then she caught herself. No, not just a mom. She was Noel's narrator, Ember's keeper, author of the only therapy that had ever reached her son. The presentation was 3 weeks later, in a beige conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and worry. 10 doctors, 2 therapists, 1 child psychologist tapping endlessly on a tablet. Emily almost turned back 3 times while walking in, a low hum of doubt clenching her stomach. They're not going to get it. They're science. I'm shadow foxes in cloud caves. But when she started reading, the air changed. She told them about how Noah had gone from silence to visual metaphors. How for the first time, seizures weren't just anomalies, but acknowledged intrusions, the enemy outside the hero's identity. She even handed around the book. One doctor flipped through, stopped on page 9, where Noel stands at the edge of a swirling vortex, and whispered, "This is what it must feel like." Emily nodded. That's the point. We gave the unnameable a name. By the end, the room was quiet. Not skeptical. Just moved. Dr. Albright sat back in her chair, thoughtful. We forget sometimes. We treat the brain like it's separate from the person living inside it. Emily exhaled through a smile. Exactly. And no one heals from a story they can't see themselves in. Back home, Noah had started something new. A journal. Each page labeled, "What Ember Knows Today." Some were one sentence. Everything loud doesn't mean danger. Others longer. When the clouds come fast, close your eyes and try to smell something that stays, like peanut butter or mom. He wasn't just healing. He was integrating, making meaning from the chaos, building himself brick by brick. And Emily? She wasn't surviving anymore. She was creating. One night, weeks later, Noah sat beside her in bed, tracing her hand. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." "You know that part in the book where Noel hears the echoes?"
Emily nodded, smiling. Where he hears voices of what people said when they were scared? Yeah, Noah said, leaning closer. I think I know now. They're not all real. Like they were real to them when they said it, but I don't have to keep them in my pack. Emily felt her throat thicken. This boy, this soul who once floated between seizures, between doctors, between numbness and confusion, was rewriting his own narrative. Without therapy speak, without a single diagnosis page in front of him. Just truth, wrapped in metaphor, held by story. In the weeks that followed, Emily created a small workshop series at a local library, open to parents, caregivers, and kids who were walking through invisible wars. She titled it simply, Write the Storm. People showed up, quiet, raw,
unsure. Mothers who hadn't slept in 3 years. Fathers with notebooks full of medication schedules but no idea what their children felt. Children, diagnosed, labeled, often overlooked, who still carried wonder. They started telling stories together. One little girl named Maya talked about the worry weavers, invisible spiders that stitched shadows into her stomach whenever her dad left for work. A boy named Deshaun drew himself as Captain Static, trapped in a looping video where everything moved too fast. Each week was a ritual of unraveling. No jargon, no data points, just hearts unburdening through ink and color. And Emily knew. This wasn't just a side project. It was a movement. During one of these sessions, as Emily knelt to pick up a crayon, a woman approached her. Brown eyes, tired, kind. She said, "I'm not much of a writer, but my daughter hasn't looked me in the eye since the diagnosis. And last night, she asked me if I wanted to meet her dream animal. Told me it was how she talked to people again. She named her Soot." She blinked back tears. "I just need to say thank you." Emily stood, hugging the woman softly. This was it. The therapy doctors didn't talk about because it didn't live in charts. It lived in moments like this. And while all this was blooming outside, inside their little home, life continued. Noah still had bad days. Somewhere between December and April, the seizures came more often again. Med adjustments, another EEG. A few nights where Emily sat on the floor beside his bed, clutching her own wrist just to stay anchored. But this time, there was a difference. Fear no longer ran the house. Story did. Even in the worst moments when Noah felt the storm rise inside him, he'd gasp, "Light string, Mom, help me find it." And they would, together. Small flashlight, slow breathing, calm voices. Anchored not in panic, but plotline. Ember was always waiting. The kids in the workshop started calling Emily the story healer. She laughed the first few times, said, "I'm not a healer, just a listener." But maybe that's what healing really was. Intentional listening, deep noticing, holding space so someone could see themselves with fresh eyes, not as broken, but as brave. She began recording audio versions of The Land of Wobble. Cheap mic, blanket over her head for soundproofing, steady, velvet voice. Ember's lines carried softly through headphones in hospital rooms across 3 states. Emails began arriving. Parents, siblings, even therapists, thanking her. One message came from a hospital janitor in Illinois. "I don't have kids. Hell, I didn't even finish school. But I listened to episode 2 on break, and man, there's something about Ember. Feels like she's talking to me." The magic wasn't just for children. It was for anyone who had ever been overwhelmed and still chose light. It is strange, Emily thought, how the world teaches us to chase answers, diagnoses, quick fixes. But the real balm? It came when we paused, listened, created. When we took our pain, wrapped it in story, and handed it back with shape, color, voice. Something to hold, to heal, to pass on. Late one spring evening, as they sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, Noah leaned against her and whispered, "Mom, do you think Ember is real?" Emily smiled at the stars. "I think she's real in all the places that matter." He nodded once, quiet, safe, and then said, "Do you think someone else might need to meet her?" "Oh, baby," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead.
They already have. The first invitation came in a manila envelope. Emily unfolded the letter on a rainy Thursday after picking up groceries. At first, she thought it was another bill or medical update until she saw the header. National Conference on Childhood Trauma and Resilience. Keynote guest opportunity. Emily Banner.
She blinked. Keynote. Guest. Her. They were moments in life when the world shifted, just slightly, on its axis. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a mirror, held up to the journey she'd walked barefoot and aching. Because once upon a time, she was just a mother, kneeling beside a hospital bed, whispering stories into the quiet. Now her whispers echoed into something bigger than she ever imagined. The night before the conference, Emily couldn't sleep. She looked out the window, watching headlights trail across distant freeway lanes like silver fireflies. She rehearsed her talk, then didn't. Rehearsed again, scrapped it all. Instead, she did the thing that had gotten her here. She told stories. Not with slides, not with stats, with heart. In the quiet before dawn, she whispered aloud the first lines of The Land of Wobble, voice cracking over an invisible mic. In a place stretched too thin by silence and storms, there lived a boy who shimmered, even when he shook. The stage lights were soft, the room full. Doctors, teachers, parents, nurses, policymakers, people from every edge of care systems, each carrying their own invisible script of exhaustion, compassion, and questions. Emily stood at the podium, not polished, not perfect. She wore a necklace Noah made from oven-baked clay and a dress she'd nearly returned 3 times out of self-doubt. But her voice? Steady. She began, "There's a therapy out there that's never been studied in randomized clinical trials. You won't find it listed in the DSM or covered by insurance. But it changes people. Not by fixing, but by witnessing. Not by labeling, but by storying." She told them about Noah, about Ember, about cloud caves and light strings, and how a child can learn emotional regulation and resilience without ever using the word resilience. Then she said something she hadn't planned. "When we gave epilepsy a name and stopped giving it a throne in our house, we healed faster. Even when healing wasn't linear, because we moved from being victims to heroes. There was silence at first, then tears, then applause. Not like at a concert, no roaring, just rising. Like a collective exhale from 1,000 people who didn't know they'd been holding their breath." Afterwards, a crowd formed around her. A behavioral therapist told her she'd just restructured an entire semester's curriculum in her head based on the talk. A father, whose daughter hadn't spoken in 5 months, asked, voice trembling, "Can you teach me how to build a world for her too?" Even speakers from earlier panels, scientists in suits, wanted to know how to integrate this heart work into trauma-informed care. She shook hands, wrote names, promised to email back, but later that night, when she was finally alone in the hotel room, she cried. Because none of this erased what she walked through. It didn't undo the seizures, the fear, the fractured sleep of 100 nights. But it meant it all mattered. That it had birthed something. Something that moved through grief and out the other side carrying light. Back home, Noah had started his own project. A 7-page zine drawn in Crayola markers and folded with tape. He titled it, "How to Foxfire." Each page was a lesson from Ember. If you're scared, press your fingers to your heartbeat. That's your body hugging you. Sad feels heavy, so imagine it's a backpack and see what's inside. If someone doesn't see your shine, it's okay. Some people forgot they used to glow too. Emily asked him what he wanted to do with it. Noah shrugged. Give them to kids who don't like talking. She smiled. You mean like a guide? "No," he said thoughtfully, "like a flashlight."
The school counselor started handing them out. Children who struggled with anxiety, selective mutism, grief. They were drawn to the curious little booklet with the foxtail on the cover. It wasn't clinical. It didn't make them feel like patients. And because it came from a kid, it spoke their language. Real, playful, free. One teacher told Emily, "I've seen more breakthroughs from this in a week than I have all semester." Somewhere between April and summer, Right the Storm grew legs. Hospitals requested sessions. A podcast invited Emily to share her story. A neuropsychology professor reached out, asking if she'd collaborate on a small study exploring child self-narration as emotional mapping. It was, slowly, becoming legitimate, not just underground wisdom passed from parent to parent in whispered forums, but something that could shift paradigms. But the biggest moment came quietly, just like all the important ones had. It was after dinner one night. Emily was loading dishes when she realized Noah had been quiet for a while. She found him in his room, headphones on, blanket over his head, the same way she'd once recorded stories for him. He was recording his own voice. She stood at the edge of the doorway, listening as he spoke into the mic with a soft, steady whisper. And when Noel found out the storm wasn't going to go away forever, he felt really mad and sad. But he told Ember, "That's okay. I still belong here, even with the shaking, even with the sky cracking. I still belong." Emily pressed a hand to her heart, breath halting. This was it. The full circle. The therapy doctors didn't talk about had just healed its own origin. Weeks later, Emily stood in front of another group, a community center this time. Low-income families, caregivers working 2 jobs, grandmothers in headscarves, tired-looking dads in zip-up hoodies. They didn't want theories. They wanted tools. So she brought her book, her voice, and Ember. By the end of the session, one young mother raised her hand, tears glistening in her tired eyes. "My son doesn't let me hug me anymore. It's like he's somewhere else all the time," she said. "But when you read your story, he leaned into my arm." Emily nodded. "That's the Ember effect. It's the gentle pull back to connection. No pressure, just presence." The mother cried openly now, nodding fast. "Can I draw our own fox?" Emily stepped down from the front and sat with her on the floor. Just 2 women, paper between them. Together, they began to draw. Outside, the world remained chaotic. Pandemics passed, new crises rose, cities burned, elected officials bickered about who mattered. But inside these tiny rooms, in circles of crayons and shaken hearts, healing happened, quietly, radically. No white coat necessary, no prescription pad required, just a story, and the courage to own it. What began as desperate bedtime whispers beside a hospital bed had become a lantern passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. And somewhere, in 100 children's bedrooms, under nightlights and in waiting rooms, voices began to rise. I am not the storm. I am the storyteller. I am coming home. It was the anniversary. 1 year since the worst seizure, the one that left Noah in the ICU for 4 days, unresponsive, the one that stole his words for weeks, the one that carved a scar right down the timeline of Emily's life, splitting it into before and after. But this year, it felt different. Not lighter, not easier, just less alone. Emily didn't mark the day with grief. She marked it with candles. Not the thin kind from birthday cakes or the scented ones that lined her bathroom counter,
but thick beeswax ones Noah liked to roll himself, golden and lumpy, like they'd been pulled straight from a fox den. They placed them on the front steps. No reason, just because. As dusk settled over their neighborhood, the world bathed in amber, quiet, still. Noah came outside barefoot, holding a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," he said. Emily opened it. His handwriting, still uneven, fierce from the seizure tremors, but bold. "Dear Mom, even when you were scared, you made the world soft. Even when I broke, you told the story better. Even when nobody clapped, you stayed. So here's my note. You are Ember, too. Love, Newell, also known as Noah." Emily pressed the paper to her chest and wept, not from sadness, but from that unnameable emotion that lives at the edge of survival, when love, pain, and awe meet in silence. She had arrived at a different kind of peace, not from cures, but from meaning. Months later, Right the Storm became a full nonprofit. Small staff, big hearts. They didn't focus on curing conditions. They focused on narrating them, making parents teacher authors, letting children draw maps of their own inner world, helping families name their monsters so they would have someone to talk to, not just something to fear. Requests started pouring in from schools, hospitals, shelters, even youth detention centers. A boy in Oregon taught other teens how to create character armor, traits they could wear in hard moments. A girl in a foster system in Louisiana wrote an epic about the Council of Lost Things, where all missing children found each other and formed their own town lit by lanterns made of old wishes. A child on the autism spectrum developed an animated character named Pause, who helped him avoid meltdowns by narrating his overwhelm in slow motion. Story by story, voices returned, not perfect, but powerful. Not happy endings, but brave continuations. One evening, weeks before Emily's second TEDx talk, Noah asked her a question. "Do you remember the first Ember story?" She smiled. "Of course I do." "What if I wrote her origin this time?" he asked cautiously, eyes bright and wondering. Emily paused, then grinned. "Only if I get to illustrate it." So they sat, knee to knee on the living room floor, soft music playing in the background, and built a new beginning. Noah spoke the words while Emily drew. Ember was born in the space between lightning and comfort. She didn't roar or burn, she glowed, always, even when no one was watching. He looked up. "Maybe that's the secret." "What is?" "To being okay." Emily tilted her head. "Tell me." "When you stop trying to be the sun and start being your own kind of foxfire." She didn't respond first, just watched him with that certain fullness that mothers know, the one made of 1,000,000 cracked moments sewn back together by quiet joy. That night, she framed the drawing, hung it next to the hospital photo, the one where Noah had tubes, pale skin, tired eyes, but also a faint smile. Because both were true, the breaking and the beginning. A year later, during a quiet online interview about childhood trauma and adaptive resilience, her host asked, "Emily, in one sentence, what would you tell parents who feel like they're drowning?" She didn't hesitate. The storm doesn't get the last word. You do. There's a final chapter to every story. Not the end, just a pause before the next telling. And in Emily's life, in Noah's, in the endless round table of storytellers they had pulled into their warm, messy, magical circle, the final chapter was always passed forward. A child now listens to Ember's story in a cancer ward in Baltimore. A teacher in New Mexico starts her day asking students, "What's your inner creature saying this morning?" A father in South Africa builds a bedtime world with his son named Dream Ground, because that's where feelings dig deep tunnels and leave treasure maps behind. The light string, once invisible, now threads through 1,000 unseen hands. And somewhere, someone's hands are trembling, unsure how to parent, how to cope, how to hope. They Google. They scroll. They click on a video titled, "The Therapy Doctors Don't Talk About, but It Changed Everything." A woman's voice rises, soft, clear, familiar. In a place stretched too thin by silence and storms. And just like that, another ember catches. Another story becomes a lifeline. And somewhere in the dark, another child begins to glow.